No say. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to welcome everyone to my town hall meeting. I'm sorry if we started a little bit late. We thought we were on and we were not. So we're figuring out the technology as we go along. This is my maiden virtual town hall meeting. I am speaking to you from my office in Springfield, and I'm very excited to be doing this. We have about 10 days left in our legislative session, which is due to us to adjourn on May 31st. The biggest issue we have remaining to grapple with is the state's budget. How are we going to fund the programs that the state supports, and what are the and whether we're going to have cuts, whether we're going to have additional revenue to support that. Governor Rauner introduced a budget in February that relied very heavily on very significant cuts out of about what is now about a $36 billion budget. I think he had about $4 billion in cuts. And another $2.2 billion that he was relying on in savings from a pension reform proposal. I think it's very clear that that pension reform proposal will not be moving ahead, and so that's an additional $2.2 billion that we're going to have to find a way to close that gap. We have had a couple of votes on the governor's turnaround agenda. Those two items being the right to work zones and the freezing of property taxes. I voted no on both of those. I don't think that the right to work zones really do anything to move us forward to address our state's fiscal situation. And the data is pretty clear from around the country that what it does is depress wages in where there are the right to work laws in place. And secondly, I think that's the data also indicates that it's very mixed on whether it actually brings jobs to the area where the right to work exists. So I felt that the better course of action there was to vote no. The second item of the governor's agenda that we voted on is the freezing of property taxes. And while property taxes are the number one issue I hear about when I'm out in the district, to my mind, the local municipalities, school districts, library districts, and park districts that rely on property taxes, those are the entities where these decisions need to be made, not at the state level. We don't collect any property taxes, and we don't spend any property tax dollars. And for us to unilaterally impose a freeze could have an impact that is not predictable in terms of police services, fire services, the impact to educational programs. So I did not think that was the right way to be proceeding. I'm continuing to participate in some discussions about addressing our state's pension problems with the governor and his staff, as well as the Republicans and the Senate Democrats. Given the Supreme Court's ruling, it's now a week ago Friday, we're still all sort of grappling with what we can do. The Supreme Court was pretty clear that impacting benefits for someone who has already started working is probably not going to be constitutional. And so basically, I think what the Supreme Court told us was go find a way to pay for it. And we are, again, still grappling and struggling with the outcome of that decision. We are still considering other pension reform proposals. We considered one this morning that's been put forward by Cook County to address their underfunding problems. And I still think that it's worth moving ahead with some kind of pension proposals that maybe have a different legal basis than what we had in the state pension reform legislation, to see if there are some solutions that we could take from some other proposals and put forward for the state. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. If I didn't say this earlier, I apologize. I have a little bit of a cold, so I may be taking a sip of water periodically, and I'm going to try not to cough, because I'm sure that's not going to be a very pleasant experience. We did ask for questions from community members and constituents before this virtual town hall meeting. And I do have a few of those. I'm going to be reading the questions, so apologize if I'm looking away from the screen to do that. The first one we got is, can we eliminate taxing entities by combining units such as, or absorbing units such as mosquito abatement districts and the tuberculosis districts and various fire districts under county and municipal umbrellas? I think the answer is very clearly yes, we can do that. And we've given actually previously some authority to DuPage County Chairman Dan Cronin to do just that in his county, and he's been fairly successful in doing that and is saving taxpayer dollars. We voted on some legislation earlier this year to extend the authority that we gave to DuPage County to every other county in the state, and I don't know whether that will ultimately make it through both the House and the Senate, but that is something that's under consideration. I actually spent quite a bit of time looking into this issue, and it's very difficult for the state to impose a one-size-fits-all, whether it's for mosquito abatement districts or other kinds of units of local government, because each one of them, as they've evolved, is in a very different situation. Some have debt, some have no debt. Some have other kind of obligations that we maybe can't impact. And if they're going to be combined into the county or they're going to be combined with a municipality, those, frankly, almost have to be looked at one by one. So that becomes a very slow and difficult and in some ways painful process to look at each unit of local government as a standalone and how can it be consolidated or merged with another unit of local government. I am delighted to say that there is a unit of local government in our district in the Prospect Heights area, the Old Town Sanitary District, that I carried legislation and was delighted, co-sponsored with Representative David Harris, legislation to merge that into the city of Prospect Heights, and I believe that will be moving ahead. But I think it's an example of how challenging it is to do these, because when you're doing them one by one, with 7,000 units of government in the state of Illinois, that's a very long, arduous task to get through all that. So again, the answer is yes, we can do it, but it's a little bit more complex than I might have anticipated when I first started looking at this question, and so it's going to take us some time, but I think it is a work still well worth doing. So I hope that answered that question. Second one, is there a reason that we cannot consolidate school districts to cut down on administrative costs? I think that that's pretty much the same answer that I gave you. I would add one more complexity when it comes to school districts, especially in the suburban area. People really like their school district, and they like having their superintendent close. They like knowing the teachers. They like having access to all that. And so it's very challenging, not only from a legal and financial aspect to consolidate school districts, but in a lot of ways it becomes complex politically as well. And I don't mean that to just shy away from a political fight. That's not at all what I mean. But there is a lack, in many ways, a lack of local support to consolidate school districts, and that makes it very, if they don't want something done, it's. Let's see, the next question I have is, most governmental agencies and municipalities are facing tough times with pension costs, a primary issue. I would certainly agree with that. What is your position on encouraging these institutions to file bankruptcy? So this has been an item for discussion this year. I think this is the first year that this has really in any serious way been considered by the Illinois General Assembly. One of the committees that I chair, the House Judiciary Civil Law Committee, had a hearing on exactly this topic earlier this year, and it was fascinating to sort of hear some insider's perspective on the Detroit bankruptcy, on the bankruptcies in California, and how those have affected the obligations of those municipalities, and whether bondholders have been impacted, retired pension, those receiving a pension benefit from the municipality have been impacted, and how have they been able to get out of under some of their very heavy debt indebtedness obligations. I'm certainly open to looking at this, because at some point I think that some of the municipalities in the state of Illinois are going to be facing exactly this, where they're going to be making almost impossible choices between paying for debt and pension obligations versus paying for current services. And especially when you're talking about emergency services like police and fire, we certainly want to make sure that those are something that we're on solid footing there. So that's an ongoing discussion. I don't think it will be resolved this spring. There are a couple of options short of bankruptcy. One is to empower either a committee or an individual to make some very difficult decisions in the way that maybe the elected officials had not been able to, so that those individuals would step in and be empowered by an existing state law to tackle those very difficult questions of how to balance all the competing demands and to make some of the decisions that maybe a bankruptcy court would make, and maybe they wouldn't. But that's one way of handling it. There are some very significant impacts I'm understanding from a municipality declaring bankruptcy. It has an impact on the state's bond rating. It could have an impact on some of the surrounding municipalities and their bond ratings. So I think it's something we want to be careful about, saying that a municipality can declare bankruptcy and not being able to really anticipate very concretely what will be the impact of that on some other units of government. It might even have an impact on the school districts, the library districts, and the park districts within that municipality, even though they may not be hurting in the same way. So again, I think the question of bankruptcy is deserving of a very serious look. I think it needs more than the remaining 10 days for us to grapple with some of those things. So I'm hoping it's a discussion that we will be continuing as the legislature continues to meet. So I'm going to go to a couple of questions that I think have been received since we started this process. Let's see. Let's see, how long would it take to change the Constitution, the Illinois Constitution, for pension reform? In the meantime, would sports betting be easier to achieve than pension reform, or going back to the 5% income tax increase? So the question of the Constitution is, wait a minute, I just lost the picture, Sarah. Is that? I tried to just go back to one of the. Okay.
Oh,
no, I'm still there. Okay, I apologize. This is my lack of technical expertise going. So the question of the constitutional amendment is a good one, because it's something that's under consideration right now. So the pension clause of the Constitution says right now that a pension benefit is a contractual right, the benefits of which shall not be diminished or impaired. And yes, I kind of do it. I do know it by memory. And that is what the Supreme Court last Friday told us, that it meant what it meant what it said, and that the legislature could not cut any benefits at all. So to change the Constitution requires that both the House and the Senate pass the exact same amendment by a 3/5 majority, which means it requires 71 votes in the House of the 118 and 36 votes in the Senate of the 59 senators. So that's already a pretty high bar. Then it goes to the voters, and it requires, I'm not an expert on this, it requires essentially a 60% approval by voters to change the Constitution. So the earliest we could do that would be to put it on the November 2016 ballot, so that it would take effect sometime after that. So we're still looking at a year and a half before something like that could take effect, even if we passed it today. So that's the timing on it. Given the Supreme Court's decision last Friday and the strong opinions that were expressed on that about the protections provided in the current Illinois Constitution, I have reservations about whether or not we can retroactively, through a constitutional amendment, change those benefits. I think the Supreme Court has pretty much said from the moment someone is hired until they die and stop receiving their benefit, it's protected. Now, there are probably smarter minds than mine, I'm sure, out there that might say, no, there's a way to change that. And I know that the governor is proposing that, and that's one of the things that we're continuing to discuss with him. But I think that there are some hurdles that we have to get over, and before we could do that. Then the question on the sports betting. I'm not a huge fan of gambling just to fund government. I have voted for it in the past because it's been sort of the only option on the table. I'm not aware of any proposals with regard to sports betting. There are certainly lots of proposals out there right now with regard to expanding the number of casinos we have, opening up a casino in the city of Chicago that could bring revenue into the city. And I think that is one thing that I'm sort of hearing through. I don't know I have any specific, I haven't had specific discussions with any of the City of Chicago representatives here in Springfield, but that's certainly one of the things I hear about. Does the city want a casino in order to help alleviate its pressures from the pension payments that it is facing? And then is it easier than the 5% tax, going back to the 5% tax increase? I don't know that it is. You know, there are opponents to raising the income tax. There are certainly opponents to expanded gaming. So I'm not sure which is easier to accomplish here in Springfield. So thank you for that question. I'm going to look at another one here. I have just had a negative encounter with a power company employee found roaming around inside our secure condo building. They're soliciting people to switch power supplier companies. One of them lied and said she worked for ComEd. The other danced around my question when I asked who he was and why he was knocking on my door, rather than buzzing me through the security system at the front entrance. What can we do to stop these unwanted solicitations and the invasion of privacy inside secured buildings? Another resident says she's receiving many of these phone call solicitations. So this is always a kind of a delicate balance between individuals' First Amendment rights and the solicitation laws. So I don't think we can ban it altogether, but certainly most municipalities do have solicitation ordinances that if you put the sign, that the no solicitation sign up on your door, those individuals are not supposed to knock. And if they do, you can report them to the municipality. And I think that they can arrest them, but I may have just overstepped my bounds in terms of my knowledge. One other way to do this, I think, is to file a complaint with the Attorney General's office. If you go to the website for Attorney General Lisa Madigan, there's a pretty clear path there to filing complaints. And I think if the Attorney General gets enough complaints, she can investigate these companies and their tactics to make sure that they're complying with the law as it is. So certainly someone that's lying and saying that they're with Commonwealth Edison, that I'm sure would not be allowed under current law. And it's the kind of thing that we could, that she can investigate and maybe bring an action against a company. So, you know, so again, I don't think we can prevent these solicitors altogether, but we can control them and regulate them. And if they're behaving improperly, I would actually encourage you to check into the solicitation ordinances with your local municipality and file a complaint with the Attorney General's office for sure. Because if she gets if it's one only, that makes it more difficult, but she's got to get a fair number of them. So it's incumbent, I think, upon each of us to, if we have problems like that, to file the complaint. All right, the next question is, this individual is disappointed with my no vote on House Bill 306. I will explain that in a minute. This bill was not about the state of Illinois education, park, or federal funding. This bill was about, I'm not getting the rest of the question. So I'll wait. Oh, it was about personal liberty. Okay, great. So the vote that I took today on House Bill 306 was a proposal to allow parents to opt out of the Illinois standardized test, the PARCC test. It's PARCC, and I don't really know what the acronym stands for off the top of my head. This is the standardized test that we take as required by federal law, and it has recently replaced the Prairie State Achievement Test that Illinois schools previously delivered. There's been a lot of controversy around the PARCC test. It's tied to the Common Core standards, which alone have generated some controversy, and it is a very lengthy test. It's required, well, it's not required, but most schools are attempting to give it on the computer when the previous test was given on paper, and there's questions about access to the necessary internet service in order to give the test, and our students, especially younger students, capable of sitting and taking a lengthy test on the computer. So I'm sympathetic to those. In fact, I introduced a bill last year to delay the implementation of the PARCC test by a year because I was getting so many complaints from my school districts about the their ability to implement the test. That obviously did not go anywhere. The PARCC test is moving ahead this spring. And so the question before us today was whether or not to allow parents to opt out of it. It is a test not the specific test, but standardized tests are required under federal law. There is a division of opinion as to whether or not this, if we allow parents to opt out, whether it would put our federal education funding dollars at risk. And I get that there are plenty of people who say no, it wouldn't. So I'm cognizant of that. But I will say, when I asked my educators, the superintendents and the principals in the district, about whether or not they would want parents to be opting out, they said, look, we don't love the PARCC test and we'd like to see it changed and we'd like to see it function differently. But if we're going to have it, allowing opt-out is not a good way to proceed. So I was sort of caught between the parents who wanted to opt out, and there were, and I get it, for persons of personal liberty, and the educators who were saying, this is the test we have, this is the standardized test we have, and opting out does not serve at the long-term educational goals of providing a standardized test. So that was the decision I had to make. I decided that again, if we were going to have it, that it would be better to require people to take the test, and if someone chooses not to, we can't force them to, but offering a path to opt out again was not my preferred choice. I think we still need to be working on making the PARCC test a better test, making it easier for both school districts and students to implement in an efficient and coherent way. And I look forward to continuing to work on that very much. Let's see. Let's see. As a parent, I'm concerned about Senate Bill 1. Again, I'll explain that, which, if passed, could decrease funding to Wheeling School District 21 to the tune of about $5 million. What are you doing to ensure that the schools in your district do not suffer this loss of crucial funding? So Senate Bill 1 has been put forward by a senator from downstate central Illinois, Senator Andy Menard, to try to bring, I think the way he would describe it is to say he's trying to bring equity to our school funding process. And what it does is try to say, for those districts that have both low property tax wealth and high poverty, and a high number of poverty level students, we want to drive more funding into those districts. And I agree that that's a very laudable goal. But the districts that are the most impacted by changing the school funding formula are districts with high property tax wealth or higher property tax wealth, and also high poverty number of students. That is exactly the profile of School District 21, which serves Wheeling, Buffalo Grove, and portions of Arlington Heights. And that's why the number that you heard there of a reduction by $5 million, I think, is about the right number. And so that is just something that I, as the representative from this area, that I would not support. And so we're pushing back, making sure that our views are heard. I'm attending a meeting tomorrow morning to express exactly this view to other members of the House and to maybe some of the advocates both for and against this proposal, to make sure that, that this is being fully vetted and understood, and the impacts understood, before we would have a vote on anything like this. In its current form, if it were to come forward before the House, I would be voting no, because I think that that's not the right thing for our districts. And especially in a time when we are resource constrained, we've been making cuts to education at the state level for 4 or 5 years now. I think this is not the time to be considering the formula, which would only serves to rob Peter to pay Paul. the time to think about this is when we have increasing resources, new revenues to be dedicating to education, and then we can think about how we might redirect those new dollars into some of these districts, which I have no question are in need, but I don't think when we're cutting resources that's the time to be having that discussion. Let's see. New sources of revenue are being suggested, including the millionaire's tax, taxing retirement income, etc. Is there any way to guarantee that money could be applied to the pension shortfall? The answer is, well, it's a difficult one because I don't know that there's any, without short of a constitutional amendment to say that the pension has to be funded as well as the benefits protected. There's no surefire guarantee for that. What one General Assembly enacts, the next General Assembly can always undo, and that's the difficulty of the legislature. That being said, I think that there's having been through these pension discussions for several years now, there's no question but what the General Assembly really understands the impact of underfunding the pension systems. It isn't good for the pension systems themselves. It's not good for those expecting a pension, and ultimately it comes back to bite those of us who are funding all that because it just increases the amount that we have to pay when we're having to make up for past failures to pay. So I think that there's a very strong commitment right now to make the pension payment. We have been doing that since Pat Quinn came into office back in '09. We have been making the statutorily required pension payment. And I think, again, you will see a very strong commitment from the General Assembly to continue to do that. But it's a really great it's a really good question, and I welcome that. Let's see. In the governor's proposed budget, he has, along with many other vital services, completely defunded autism services. Will the final budget include these cuts? So with 10 days to go and no final proposal out there, I can't guarantee anything. I can tell you from my perspective, that is not the way I want to proceed. I think it's important that we not gut our human services support systems in the state of Illinois, and that we find a way and we have been making cuts in those areas, but to defund them altogether, I think is not a good way of proceeding. And I think the same thing about education, higher education, public safety, our prison systems, our Illinois State Police, all those things. They have sustained cuts over the last several years, and I think we are in a position where we're going to have to continue to do that. But to gut them and defund them completely, I think is not healthy for the state of Illinois. So to my mind, it's going to take some revenue enhancements from where we are today at a 3.75% income tax rate to make that happen. And I don't know what a package will look like. It may include some of the things that the questioner asked about, a millionaire's tax or a tax on services, tax on retirement income. Those are all items on the table, and I'm not promoting one or the other. I simply would like to see a package that can fund what I think are the necessary services for the state of Illinois. Let's see. I believe that environmental issues are some of the most pressing concerns we face today. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? So I've done a lot of work on environmental issues since I arrived in the General Assembly. To my mind, one of the most intriguing and pressing issues we face right now is the question of how do we make sure that we have an adequate electric supply while still protecting our environment. And there's been numerous proposals put forth this year in the Illinois General Assembly, one from Commonwealth Edison, one from Exelon, who owns the nuclear plant facility, nuclear generation facilities in Illinois, and one that I've sponsored, put forward by a broad coalition of folks who produce renewable energy, as well as work on energy efficiency projects to try to move those issues forward. Now, none of them are moving ahead this spring because I think we need to have a broader, more in-depth discussion about how do we balance all those interests in the state of Illinois? How do we make sure that we have an adequate electric supply? How do we make sure that it's as clean as it can be? Those are complex, difficult discussions that we did not really dig into this spring. I think mostly in part because we had a new governor, and we were trying to deal with that agenda. And now, with 10 days ago, the budget is first and foremost. But I look forward to having that discussion. The question around energy efficiency is, for me, a very interesting one, because if we don't have to produce the electricity, if we can save on it in our homes, in our businesses, and reduce our demand, not only does that mean that we don't have to produce as much electricity, it means that we don't have as much pollution from producing that electricity. So that's a double benefit, and it's why I think excuse me, our efforts really need to be focused on energy efficiency and making investments in energy efficiency. One of the significant benefits of investing in energy efficiency is there are lots of jobs around that. Since in the last, I'm going to maybe get my number wrong here, but I think it's the last 4 or 5 years since Illinois has put policies in place that promote energy efficiency, we've garnered 100,000 new jobs in the state of Illinois. Now that's more than Commonwealth Edison and Exelon combined in their workforce. And there are studies out there that say that if we put more energy efficiency programs into a place, we could create an additional 32,000 jobs a year. And the reason that works so well is and they're spread all over the state. They are installing insulation in homes, making sure that we have windows, the best lighting we can have. It's all very sort of like small stuff, but it's important small stuff, and it has a significant impact on our consumption of electricity. And so it's really, I think it's important that we as a state continue to invest in that. So I think I just have one other question then, and that's, this is a kind of a narrow topic, but nonetheless, for those interested in your privacy rights, this will be of interest to you. I've been hearing a lot about information and opinions on automatic license plate readers. Can you discuss how they're being used and whether or not their use is being regulated? So I have to admit, I knew nothing about these automated license plate readers until this spring, but I think they've been pretty prevalent out there. Law enforcement and some private companies set up cameras on the roadways and take pictures of our license plates as we drive by. And then they retain those records. So law enforcement uses them to try to maybe solve some cold cases or track down where bad guys have been, criminals have been at any particular moment, and tie that to the scene of a crime. So they do have legitimate uses, but it's also, frankly, pretty intrusive to my mind that we would be having our every movement tracked while we're on the public right-of-way. So there's been some legislation brought forth this year to require that if these are going to be used and companies are using them and law enforcement is using them, that we limit the amount of time that those records can be retained and limit the uses for which those records can be utilized. I was a strong supporter of that legislation because I think it really speaks to our privacy and especially our privacy in this day and age of the internet, and where our privacy is so challenged by a lot of these technologies. So that legislation did pass the House. I don't know where it stands in the Senate right now, but I think it's a really a good step forward in protecting our personal privacy, which is something I've tried to focus on in the General Assembly. Looks like I might have one more. Pardon me?
More.
Oh, a couple more. Great. Okay. Can we tighten our TIF laws to ease the property tax burden? Yes, we can, and there have been some proposals to try to do that. They have not met with much success, but I think in terms of, I'm sorry, the TIF laws this is the tax increment financing, and this is a creation of state law, but it's utilized by municipalities for economic development. So, for example, how it's intended to be used is if a municipality has a blighted property or a blighted block or a blighted area within its boundaries, it can declare that as part of a tax increment finance district. And then so what happens then is the property tax assessment level, it's the property tax assessment level, not the property taxes themselves. Property tax assessment level is frozen at that level. And if it's then redeveloped, any of the new property tax assessment value that results from that development can go back in to pay for some infrastructure that maybe helped that development take place. I know it's kind of complex, but that's the best way I know how to explain it. Now, there are plenty of abuses around the state. You know, is the property really blighted, or does a municipality or a developer just simply want to use that as a tool to help defray some of the costs? And that's some of the struggle we have had, is how to further define and refine the definition of blight. Can we protect against developers who are taking advantage of the tax dollars and maybe using it for other purposes? Some of the laws allow for contiguous TIF districts for dollars to be moved from contiguous district to another district. There's a whole bunch of those kinds of things. And again, we have looked at that, and there's been some legislation developed, but it has not, I think, had the support to move ahead. And that's one of the challenges we face, is that sometimes we can have good ideas and support legislation, but it doesn't have enough support to move ahead. So, good question. I know, kind of a narrow topic, but a good one that impacts all property taxpayers, because most municipalities have some kind of TIF district that they're utilizing, and the school districts are impacted by it too because of that freezing of the property tax assessment. So the next question is, why did it take so long for the Supreme Court to rule on pensions? Was the vote split? If so, was it based on party lines as it is in the U.S. Supreme Court? Great question. So unlike, I've learned a little bit about this in the last week or so. The U.S. Supreme Court has, once it has its sessions, so that once they have an argument, they have a deadline by which they have to rule. The Illinois Supreme Court does not have such a deadline. And I think, frankly, based on separation of powers, the legislature would be unable to impose such a deadline on them. So it's completely within the purview of the Supreme Court to hear an argument whenever they want and then decide whenever they're ready. And so in the example of the pension case, it was actually pretty fast for them. The argument was heard in the middle of March. I want to say it was March 16th or 17th. And they just ruled last Friday, which would have been May, whatever it was, 7th or something like that. So that actually was pretty fast. We had another case that involved healthcare benefits for state workers and state retirees that was decided last July, but that was argued in September of 2013 and not decided until December of 2014. So the pension case actually came down pretty quickly. It was a unanimous decision, 7-0. So it did not split along party lines, obviously. I don't know, I certainly have no insight into what the discussions were behind the scenes and whether any of the debate broke down along party lines, but certainly the decision did not. I think I thought I asked that one already. About it said, did it come in again? Yeah. Okay, so the question came in again about can we make it easier? Oh, this is a little different though. Can we make it easier for school district to consolidate? We could right now, and you're stretching. I'm going to stretch my memory a little bit as to the process that's allowed under current law. But I believe that both districts, if you're going to have two districts consolidate, it requires a majority vote of the voters in both districts to be able to do that. And that makes it really difficult. I can tell you from the experience in the district that I represent in Northbrook and Glenview, School District 30 is having terrible struggles because of the property tax appeals that Allstate has pursued year after year after year and been successful year after year after year. So they've lost millions of dollars to the property tax appeals by Allstate. So they're in a very different debt and revenue position than every other surrounding district in Northbrook and Glenview. And if I take my legislator hat off and say, and just am a citizen in one of those school districts, I say, well, why would I want to assume that debt? Why would I want to assume that low property tax revenue in that district and mix that with mine that's quite healthy and doing well right now? So I get that that's very difficult. I suppose there are ideas out there for how we could make it easier to consolidate. We've tried to create some incentives to do that, but those are primarily targeted, to my mind, primarily targeted at downstate districts where they're losing a lot of population, and they no longer can really adequately, they have the school age population becomes so small that they're no longer really able to fill the school, and they need to maybe consolidate with another district. So that's where that's primarily been targeted. I certainly would welcome, if you have ideas about how to make it easier, feel free to email me. If you just go to my website, which is Rep Nekritz, R-E-P, nekritz.org, it's very easy to send me an email, and I would welcome those suggestions. Because, again, I think consolidation is a really big issue. It does cost our state a lot, but it's very challenging to get done, on any sort of broad brush basis. Since the budget is a constitutional issue, how is Illinois able to skirt this issue with the Illinois Supreme Court? So I don't know that exactly the question, but I think the question may be, the Constitution does require Illinois to adopt a balanced budget, and how are we able to skirt that? There's lots of mechanisms for us to do that. We have utilized all these tools over the years. One is to simply push bills off into the next fiscal year. So if we don't have enough revenue to match what we think we're going to be able to spend, we just say, well, we'll pay that bill in the next fiscal year. We can do some borrowing from other state funds, in addition to the general revenue fund, which is our income tax, sales tax, cigarette taxes, gambling taxes, all that. So some of those smaller sources of revenue. In addition to those all go into the general revenue fund. But we have a lot of other state funds. So the biggest one we have out there is the road fund, which is where all of your gasoline tax, your per gallon gasoline taxes go to fund improvements and maintenance for roads, bridges, and transit. So we can borrow from those other funds or take from those other funds to help close a budget gap, and we do those kinds of things as well. I will say that for fiscal years 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, and we're currently in fiscal year 15. In those years, we actually, I know it didn't get much media coverage, but we actually did balance our budgets, and in fact, we under appropriated those years so that we were able to pay down some of the backlog of bills. And we reduced that backlog of bills at one point from almost 10 billion to just over 4 billion. And again, the math only works that way if you're not spending every dollar you're taking in and able to apply it to some old bills. So we were doing a pretty good job of that. I will freely admit that for this current fiscal year, the one we're in, the one when the income tax rolled back, we passed an out-of-balance budget, and I think the intent was to maybe come back in and find some more revenue. We have now done that with the governor on a bipartisan basis, found a way to close that gap with the borrowing from other state funds, and we have a balanced budget again this year. But that does not mean that we're facing a similar situation for next year. We still have a pretty significant budget gap that we're going to have to be closing for the next fiscal year, which starts July 1, and I'm looking forward to working with the governor to see if we can come to some resolution, hopefully by May 31st. It does not get any easier for us after May 31st. After May 31st, we have to have more legislators in support of, we need a supermajority, which again is 71 in the House versus 60, which is a supermajority, and 36 in the Senate, which is the supermajority, versus 30 in the House, 30 in the Senate, which is the majority. So it doesn't get any easier when we go past May 31st. So I'm hoping we can come to a bipartisan agreement to adequately fund services and move ahead with what will undoubtedly be some more challenges that we'll have for the state. So I think that's all the questions we have. Again, I'm very grateful for those of you that stuck it out with us. I appreciate the questions. I thought that they were really good and insightful questions and important questions for the state of Illinois. So I'm very grateful for that. I would welcome your feedback on what you thought of this, whether we should do these again, whether it was useful, helpful, too long, too short, whatever ideas you have about it, please let me know. And I do appreciate your continued interest in Illinois state government, and whatever I can do to address your questions or concerns, please don't feel like you have to wait for a town hall meeting. I and John Amdor, my legislative director, are always available to help solve your problems or answer your questions. So again, thank you very much, and look, I hope I look forward to seeing you on June 1st.